We were a working group within the German Educational Research Association in the section of history. And I welcome you on behalf of the speakers, which are at the moment Alexander Meyer from the LMU in Munich, Martin Holy from the history department of the University in Prague and the Scientific Academy in Prague. Then we have Sebastian Engelmann, which is at now the English title of the University of Education in Karlsruhe, Michael Rocher from the University of Siegen, and me, Susanne Speaker from the University of Koblenz-Landau. So I'm moderating this meeting, and I have the honor to introduce our guest, Luana Salvarini from the University of Parma in Italy. Luana will present on the age of humidity, ancient medicine, and childhood education in the Renaissance. Welcome, Luana. Luana Salvarini holds an associate professorship in the history of education at Parma. She has a master in humanities and a second master in music composition. Her PhD she obtained in the theory and tradition of Italian Salvarini in 2003. Her research focus lies on the history of education, where she based on her training as philologist, researches on the 16th and 17th century. In the last years, she published on the Protestant thinking in Europe, for instance, on the concept of Beruf in Luther's works. Other works of her research lie in the 19th century, and there, with regard to the US-American history of education. And during Isha in Milan this year, I heard a stunning presentation on Sunday schools in the borderlands of the expansion to the West. Luana, thank you for being here with us tonight, and I leave the floor to you.
Thank you, Susanne. Thank you for the beautiful and very generous presentation. My presentation, I'll try to take not too long, but to focus on text so that we will have materials to discuss on. Because it's, of course, in this short presentation, I want to give all the elements about this subject. My objective is to focus on how the connection between ancient medicine and educational treatise began indeed earlier than is thought. We normally speak about the age of humanist medicine, the rediscovery of ancient medical texts in the 16th century with the first edition of Galen's works. But indeed, medical humanism began, especially in Italy, much earlier, at the beginning of the 15th century, with the Padua school, and for example, and on the Ferrara school, so that it began at the same time with the tradition of educational treatises. So the reflection on education, which began at the beginning of the 15th century, and the rediscovery of ancient medicine were born at the same time and influenced mutually the one with the other, with different accents and different focus all along the 15th century. And the end of the 16th, they had a full flourishing with the work of Juan Huarte, the first physician, which wrote a very influential treatise on education, which changed it totally the way education was thought in what we call the ancien regime. I try to go on the presentation, starting from some data, so that we can have a general framework of text and influence. Here we are, the majority of you are specialist on history of education, so I don't have to explain you how Renaissance education started from the necessity of politics and diplomacy, especially. A new leadership was required to manage the relationship between states and between forces in Renaissance Europe. And court life was the place in which this new way of managing power was built. So the reflection about education was explicitly focused on the qualities of the leader, the necessity of an educated and highly refined leader, but its aims were much more down on earth. Between this production, there are some very important milestones. The first is around 1410, when Guarino Veronese, or Guarino Guarini, as we call him in Italy, which was a humanist, but most of all, perhaps the most famous educator in Italy, which he had a school and he wrote a lot of educational text. And Guarino translated into Latin the text on education, which was attributed to Plutarch at the time. Today it is not anymore, but it is included in the Moralia. His book on education was translated with a Latin title, De Liberis Educandis, and from that moment on, it was perhaps the most read book about education in Europe. The manuscript tradition is impressive. It was copied, and there are so many copies in libraries all across Europe that we can imagine. It enjoyed a diffusion which was beyond the normal diffusion of manuscript text in the middle 15th century. And at the same time, in the same years, Pierpaolo Vergerio, who is the older, there is another, the younger Pierpaolo Vergerio, who is well known for in the history of Reformation. But this is the older, the uncle, I think, or the grandfather, I'm not sure, but he is the Pierpaolo Vergerio the older, which wrote in Latin a book, De Ingenuis Moribus et Liberabulibus Studis Adolescentes, which is the most important at the age original book. So not anymore a translation, but an original book on education, which borrows a lot from Guarino's work. And the similarities in text make clear that he drew directly from the Latin translation. The majority of these humanists which were involved in educational reflection normally read in Latin. They knew Greek, but they normally read Latin text and quoted in Latin. So Pierpaolo Vergerio's book, and some years later, another book in Italian language, Della Vita Civile by Matteo Palmieri, which began the tradition of Florentine educational tradition, which has a life on its own. But today we won't stop so much on Matteo Palmieri because he didn't write about childhood. And today we focus on childhood, how it was described in this author, and how medicine influenced their writings. De Liberis Educandis is already incorporated some element of Galenic medicine in the more general ones, nothing very specialist, but incorporated some elements of Galenic medicine when describing childhood and describing also the transition from childhood to adolescence. Another data. In the meanwhile, at the same time, especially in the second half of the 15th century, with Ferrara, Niccolò Leoniceno started a medical school inspired to humanism and started translating into Latin the work of Galen, and so at the same time there are humanism mixed. These new concepts weren't new, but they were rediscovered, drawn by Galen on human nature and temperaments, and of course the reflection of the development of human body was very interesting for educational writers. As we said before, this medical humanism started earlier, as it is normally described, but when with 1525, we have the first complete edition by Aldo Manuzio in Greek, and then the same year, the first edition of the Corpus Hippocraticum in Latin. So a very important year in the history of medicine. But for the reasons we said before, the greater impact was the complete Galen in Latin. We had several editions. There are, with the complete, it's not so many, but around 10, not all really complete, but around 10 complete or nearly complete editions by Galen in Latin in a few decades. The most influential is the 1542 edition by Froben in Basel. I say the most influential because when I found a quotation by Galen in Latin in these authors, I always I looked through all the edition, the available edition by Galen, and I found the text was always identical to the one including the Basel edition. So it was the most widespread, perhaps for reason of price, or I don't know. It is very important because there is a very important text, the Quod Animimores Temperamenta Sequentur in Latin, which is the text most used by educational writers, because explains how character, personality is shaped by the body, and this text was absent in the Greek edition, the Aldine edition, because it had been lost. It was rediscovered later. And so only the Latin edition had this text, which was drawn from a medieval Latin translation. This is very interesting because today we won't have the time to discuss this, but this is very interesting because contemporary translation, for example, the Cambridge translation of Galen, which is drawn from the Greek text, of course, brings a different text from the one which was read in the Renaissance, because it came from the Latin medieval translation, which was drawn from a different Greek text and perhaps an Arab text. And then so it follows at the end of the 15th century, a second wave of the educational treatise, and which were much more influenced from medicine. And the most famous is Juan Huarte, Examen de Ingenios in Spanish, which Juan Huarte wasn't a humanist, was a physician, and it inaugurated a new way of thinking about education, which was heavily inspired Jesuits and their project of shaping personalities through education. So let's go to texts. Of course, I write on the slide Galen on childhood, but of course I'm not going to represent the thousands of words written by Galen on childhood, but only the two passages which were very influential and were retaken and rephrased in the majority of educational treatises. Here I present the Latin text is taken from the Basel edition, and here there is my translation. So if someone finds some mistake in the translation, is welcome to say that. And Galen says that the newborn is still extremely wet, like seaweed, maris alga. This is a passage that has been changed today with the Greek text. So in modern translation, we don't find anymore this comparison with seaweed, but they read it like that, and I think it is very interesting. Not just in its vessel, organs, and flesh, but even in its bones, which are the driest of our parts. So the child is wet, is wet in all his body. However, the infant's nurses shape them, and with them, each respective link as a wall like wax figures. And this image of wax remains us immediately on the theory of memory, the ancient theory of memory, the Aristotelian tradition, which says that you can impress memories in the mind like it was wax. And this is a physical impression. So, for example, at the beginning, in the morning, you are free. You can memorize easily. At the end of the day, the wax is full of impression and it's harder. And with age, memory is declining because you have too many impressions on it. So much is the wetness in the whole body of the infant. Here, Galen focuses on body, but this flexibility of the body was always quoted as corresponding to a flexibility of the intellect and intelligence of the temperament, the whole temperament. So as you can shape the newborn physically, you can shape the newborn also in educational terms. And also he discusses a lot about about heat, and about the relation between heat and humidity. Of course, heat dries humidity. There is a lengthy discussion in the temperamentis. I don't want to bother you with that, but at the end he says, the young man and the child are equally hot, but the one is also humid and the other is dry. From this comes many of the the educational difference between them, because one of the problems which was afforded from many of the authors was why the child is so easy to educate. They said that. If they say that, I guess they were right. And then why the adolescent is so difficult to manage. The problem is eternal. So the difficulty in managing the nobleman adolescence was explained with this Galenic theory. He says, after consideration of very many occasions of children, a large number of young men and youth, and of the same child both as infant and when grown to youth, I did not find that none was hotter than the other, between childhood and the prime of life. It is only, as already stated, that in children the heat appears to the touch more vaporous, and also appears full and pleasant, while in those in their prime it appears light, dry, and not equally pleasant. Here there is something like also a moral, something like a moral nuance. The heat of the child is pleasant because he's human, he's humid, you can shape him. The humidity of the heat of the adolescent is hard, is dry, it's difficult to manage. For much of a child's substance which is wet flows away to the outside, but little in the prime of age. So it is very important because the majority of authors pinpoints that it's difficult to manage morally the adolescent because the humidity is gone away. Humidity of childhood is gone away. This allows intellectual education because all this humidity hinders intellect. This allowed intellectual education, but makes moral education more difficult because this heat brings passion, brings instincts, brings everything we know. So the only possibility is given to philosophy, and especially moral philosophy, to manage this heat and its moral consequence. Okay. Here I'd like to present the Liberis Educandis this is the first Italian edition, the first edition, not Italian, the first edition we have found, the first incunabulum, which is Italian, which was printed in Venice in 1472. But I always use first edition because I think they represent the way the text was most known. Of course, the text, we said before, enjoyed a great manuscript tradition. And we have a lot of translation also in modern languages, not also into Latin. But the majority of them was translated, for example, in German from Latin, not going back to the original Greek. So, of course, there are mistakes or mistranslations in this double passage. But this was a normal occurrence in Renaissance print, print tradition, and also explains we like these mistakes because they help us a lot in identifying which texts were exactly read by our authors. Here are some examples of this tradition. The first Italian edition, for example, you can see on the left, the most widespread, more also less expensive edition of the Italian edition of the Moralia. We have all together here. It was very small print. It's it's really a punishment to read, but it was not so expensive. So it was very widespread. For example, two examples of German editions. An edition only in German, the Strasbourg edition, which was translated from Guarino's Latin, and another edition which were more was more scholarly, where we have both, was retranslated from Greek. So we have both the Greek and the Latin text. Which are a concept of childhood in the Liberis Educandis. Again, it's a Greek text, but it participated in the same of some of the tradition which also inspired Galen. So it inspired also this text. There are we can't show here. We don't aim to show direct influence between this text and Galen's text, but the pertaining the recurrence of some concepts which were common in the two texts. And here I choose a passage which is very common, also very recalled in a traditional text. Here on the left, the Incunabulum edition, and on the right, my translation. For just as is necessary immediately after birth to begin to mold the limbs of the children's bodies. You can find the same concept we have found in the Temperamentis, in order that they may grow straight and without deformity. So in the same fashion, it's fitting from the beginning to regulate the characters of children. You see that while in Galen, it was neutral. It simply said the child is wet, is easy to mold. Here is very active. There is the idea of education as mold in action, and it's not neutral. He said you have to regulate the personality of children. For youth, it's easy to mold and soft, and while such minds are still tender, disciplines can be easily infused. But anything which has become hard is with difficulty softened. So our lessons impress upon the minds of children while they are young. So take the time while they are young, because then it can be too late. In the Latin text, he translated as doctrine, lessons, but to be general, because he can mean cultural aspects. You learn easily as you are a child, but all the context of the chapter tells us it means especially moral concept. So the idea that you have to shape the personality, not only cultural components. And also in the Renaissance tradition, they always speak at the beginning, for example, they always speak of educating with culturally education, not before 7-year-old. So before 7-year-old, when they were really soft, education was mostly moral. And we go on with another text, so that I don't take it too long. We have here Pretus Paulus Vergerius, the Ingenuus Boribus. We spoke about it before. Here, the first page of the Incunabulum is really not so friendly to read as many incunabula. Normally, when we say the manuscript tradition of this text, it was normally copied together with the Liberis Educandi. So you have the same book, the same paper book, where together there are the Liberis Educandi in Guarino's translation and Pretus Paulus Vergerius book. So they were read together and considered part of a first canon of educational text. And also it enjoyed a very early print tradition. Here we can see in Vergerio recalls the concept by the Gallen's book, or better, the Latin translation of Gallen's book, Quod Animi Mores, recalling very explicitly that anima complexionem sequit corporis. So our soul follows the body. How the body is, so the soul is. So you have the possibility to educate the children and then the adolescent follows the development of the body. You have no way to go over it. It says they are speaking about young people. Here in Vergerio, we don't have the title is Liberalibus Studis Adolescentiae, and we don't have not so much about childhood. He begins with a later age and explains how and why, how adolescents have to be educated and why they are so difficult to. And he said, exceedingly credulous, for lacking what experience, they believe whatever they hear is true. Also, their opinion changes easily, since their bodily humors are in motion due to growth, and they have in abundance the heat, which provokes motion. We said there are heat in the child, according to Gallen, in the child and in the adolescent, but in adolescents there are not so much humidity to make this heat softer, and this heat provokes all this motion. The soul, in fact, follows the complexion of the body. Therefore, just as those who lack something are quick to desire it, so they are swiftly satisfied once obtained. They follow their passions above all and do everything with great vigor, because they have strong desires spurred by their bodily heat, while they lack rational powers and prudence that could moderate them. Young people follow their passions because heat in their body makes them prone to passions and to desire. And they don't have enough rationality, which later will say one parte, rationality comes with dryness. So they need more time to become adults, to become dry enough to lose the remaining wetness and became dry enough to be rational. So as it will explain better in fully developed in Huarte's theory, we have an idea of childhood very wet and humid, and only able to memorize. Adolescent, hot and humid, hot and half humid, so prone to desire, passion, imagination. And then with adult age come dryness, and dryness is rationalities and develops the intellect. So adult age is the age for culture and philosophy, literature, and the higher disciplines. It's interesting to see that in the 15th century educational tradition, they never speak about early childhood. They start with the 7-year-olds, and this has a practical reason. Children up to 6, 7 were left to the women to be cared for, and were given to the educator, to the teacher, which in Italy we call the precettore, the preceptor, were given at 7, normally between 6 and 7. So before, the child was considered something very half animal, half human. His rationality was considered not enough developed to reach a full-blown education, only a very soft material to mold. But this changes during the 16th century, and my theory is that it changes under the influence of medical thought and the idea that each age has its own learning abilities. So you don't have only the rational learning. You can start at 7, but also from 3 to 5 years old, the children were started to be considered able to be educated and interesting for educators, which is not so obvious. And we start this tradition with Alessandro Piccolomini's dell'istituzione di tutta la vita dell'uomo nato nobile in città libera, which means the lifelong education of the nobleman born in a free city. This treatise is dedicated to a woman, to the mother of the nobleman Alessandro Colombini. And this, I think, this is a rhetorical device. It's not necessarily the truth, but it motivates the way that there is interest in this section of education, which was given traditionally to women before entering the entrance of the preceptor. I go on with the presentation. I'll try to be, I'll be very short. As I said, the early children we considered for the first time, there is a chapter on the education of children up to the age of 3. Here I don't want to read all the slide, but he always quotes Aristotle, but at the end he uses a mix of sources. He says children should not languish in idleness, but should be accustomed very gradually to some movements of hands and feet of their limbs, so that they increase their natural heat and get rid of some of the excessive humidity. Again, the idea of humidity that have to be flown away to have the full possession of abilities, but also the idea of a childhood that had to be cared for with special attention so that the development can be obtained. While from the 3rd to the 5th year, Piccolomini says when children are 3 years old, their intellect is starting to emerge. It's very early. This is interesting because it's much earlier than in other treatises. The idea is intellecting is not, it doesn't start at 7 or 6, 7, or 8 years old, but it emerges earlier because this mission of humidity is gradual. So it's logical that you don't have an age when the intellect begins, but a gradual transition from memory and humidity to intellect. And this age is not good, but the children learn as in school because it's too early to go to school. But you can learn the mother tongue, and the intellect is not still developed, and excessive intellectual effort will impede the natural growth. We are in here also this is drawn from medicine. The idea that the growing forces, energies, can be subtracted from the child if you give him too much to learn. So these energies have to be left to the child in order to dispel the humidity and go on with growth. And I'm going towards the end of my presentation with one word examining ingenious. There is a mistake in this slide because it's 1575. But yes, I don't know why I wrote 1574. This is the frontispiece of the first edition, which was printed in Baeza in Spanish at home of a friend of the author, because he didn't enjoy so much academic possibilities. He was a doctor, he worked as a doctor, a physician, and he didn't have so much academic credentials. This book was very interesting also in the history of medicine, because he says explicitly, I want to begin from Galen's Quod Animi Mores, and I want to go on starting from this. I want to say, to develop what Galen didn't write, because he didn't have the time. He thinks Galen didn't have the time to finish this book. He takes these suggestions and says, I want to explain that all your qualities can be educated, but your qualities are determined from your body, so you can't educate anyone out of his talents. So the educator is not omnipotent. We developed in the Renaissance the idea of the perfectus magister, the idea of the teacher who can make flourishing all sorts of pupils, the good and the bad ones. It was also politically necessary to say that also bad pupils could be educated, because if you had a prince which has a very stupid son, you had to accept it and give them the mentor, give the teacher the task to develop his not so big intelligence. But Huarte says, on the contrary, that society should change, should bring the most talented men the power, and send to the fields, he says, the not intelligent men which were the power at the time. But this also says, but I know this is impossible today, but perhaps in the future. And he says that only the doctor, only the physician can do this, because it's only the physician that can make the exam of talents, understanding from the body which were a person's abilities, and then direct them very strictly to their destiny, to their educational destiny. Because he said, society so will function perfectly. We won't have any waste of energy. Very good. We won't have bad doctors, bad lawyers, or bad writers, because anyone will follow his own talent. And we won't have not so many stupid person anymore, because the doctor can tell the parents what they should say to generate intelligent children. So it also gives techniques on what to eat, when to eat, and when to drink, and what to do when you are making children, and during, before and after, so that to shape and direct the reproduction towards the best results. Here are some examples of the diffusion of this book, which was very early translated in many modern languages. So we have the Italian edition, the English edition, which was taken from the Italian, indeed. So again, a double passage, the French and the Flemish edition, the Dutch edition. That this is not so common in the book market at the time. Here, I didn't want to take a passage to read. It was very interesting to do it, but there are so many. Half of the books speaks about childhood, so I didn't have the possibility to read with you everything. So I only managed to make some points. Many of them I already anticipated. So we have the individual bodily temperament is the only source, he says, of one's own abilities. So you can't become a good lawyer or a good philosopher or a good musician if you don't have in yourself the talent, and this talent comes from the body, only from the body. of course, this book had a lot of problems with the Inquisition. At the end, it was forbidden because basically it said the soul, okay, we have a soul, but the soul is conditioned on how the mortal part of us, the body, is. So, of course, on the religious side, this was a little problematic. You don't have to choose your educational path and profession. It must be determined by temperament. You can have the prevalent imagination, intellect, or memory if you are hot, humid, hot, dry, or cold, humid. You say you are cold and dry when you are dead, so we don't speak about that. So for him, we have 3 possibilities of prevalent mental ability and connected to 3 mixtures. The educator loses power. And as we said before, parents should program the talents of the child through reproductive techniques, all for the state, because the res publica had to enjoy good people, the right person at the right place. And child is the age of memory, also, of course, also in Huarte, who follows very strictly Galen. But from the beginning, you can see the prevailing talent of a child. And he gives an example of this. This is in Spanish, but I can translate it at the moment. It's not so difficult, so I didn't write it down. He says, when you see a child that is very good to make drawings, he can, at first, he sees a horse, and the first sight can make the drawing of this horse. Don't lose your time to make him study Latin. Ningún género de letras. Don't lose your time. Give it to a painter to learn this activity. And this is beyond the idea of humanist education, because it's completely beyond the idea that you have to start from humane literae, from Greek, Latin, and so on. You say, if you are good at painting, if you are good at fighting, for example, if you are good at some practical activities, start from them and don't care about literature if you are not done for that, even if you are a nobleman. And it is totally different from humanities tradition. And I want to finish with this reading only to summarize, because it's the first page of his book when he presents his ideas. And he simply says that Cicero, the example of the perfect man of the antiquity, had a son which was very stupid. So even if he gave him a great educational advantage, he went to the best schools. He found him the best teachers. He wrote books of philosophy for him, but he remained stupid because he didn't have any possibility to go beyond the possibility of his body, che salió in gran necio con poca eloquencia y menos filosofía. So Huarte condemns the choice of Cicero to disregard the child bodily temperament and wanted to make him a philosopher only because as father it was his ambition as a father. And I think this is a very interesting thought to be told by a 16th century writer. Thank you for your patience.